It's Saturday, June 6th, 2026, and the week's biggest stories look very different on the surface. Ballots are still being counted in California. Congress is fighting over a nearly $70 billion immigration enforcement package. The International Space Station is dealing with an air leak. Public health officials are warning about an Ebola outbreak in Central Africa. A cattle parasite has reappeared in Texas. Tech stocks just had a brutal sell-off, and the New York Knicks are 2 wins away from their first NBA title since 1973. That sounds like chaos, but there is a common thread. Across politics, markets, sports, public health, and technology, institutions are being asked to do something very hard: move quickly, withstand pressure, explain themselves clearly, and keep public trust intact. That trust is the story. And this week it is under strain almost everywhere you look. Welcome back. I'm your host, and today we're taking a wide-angle look at several ongoing stories that may seem disconnected, but together say a lot about the current moment. This is not just a rundown of headlines, it's a map of pressure points. Some of these stories are concrete. A Senate vote happened. A basketball game ended 105-104. NASA confirmed precautions around an air leak. The USDA confirmed New World screwworm in Texas. The CDC published alarming Ebola modeling. Markets sold off sharply. Other stories are still unsettled. Allegations are under investigation. Ballots are still being counted. Labor negotiations are unresolved. Diplomatic talks remain fragile. Apple has not yet shown whether its next AI push will satisfy investors, developers, or consumers. So today, we'll separate what we know from what is being alleged, what is being interpreted, and what could happen next. Let's start in California, where election administration is once again at the center of the national political conversation. California's primary count is still moving through the system, and Democrat Xavier Becerra has advanced to the general election for governor, as the race to succeed term-limited Governor Gavin Newsom takes shape. That part is straightforward. The more complicated part is the atmosphere around the count. Federal prosecutors in Los Angeles have announced multiple election fraud investigations related to California elections and sent a prosecutor to the Los Angeles County Vote Counting Center. Officials have released few details about the allegations or targets. Los Angeles County officials say ballot processing is open to public observation, and that the federal attorney received an overview of that system and toured the facility. Here is the important distinction: slow counting is not evidence of fraud. California's system takes time because of vote-by-mail volume, signature verification, and rules allowing some ballots to arrive after Election Day if they are properly postmarked. That can be frustrating. It can also create room for political narratives to harden before the count is complete. That is the institutional challenge. Election officials have to finish the count accurately, but they also have to communicate enough detail, often enough, to prevent the information vacuum from being filled by suspicion. In Los Angeles, that same dynamic is playing out in the mayoral race. Mayor Karen Bass appears positioned for a November runoff, while the second slot remains contested. City Council member Nithya Raman has narrowed the gap with Spencer Pratt, whose early showing reflected anger in parts of the West Side and in fire-affected communities. The final matchup depends on remaining ballots. Again, the issue is not only who wins, it's whether voters believe the process was legitimate when the timeline is slow and the politics are hot. Now zoom out to Washington, where immigration policy is the week's dominant legislative fight. The Senate approved a nearly $70 billion immigration enforcement package by a 52-47 vote, with Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski as the lone Republican no vote and Democrats opposed. The measure now moves to the House. Supporters describe it as border security and enforcement funding, aimed at agencies such as ICE and Customs and Border Protection. Critics describe it as a massive expansion of deportation capacity and warn about weak guardrails on federal spending. For investors and business leaders, immigration policy is not just a social or political issue. It touches labor availability, construction, agriculture, hospitality, food service, logistics, and compliance costs. If enforcement funding expands significantly, employers could face more inspections, more worker disruption, and more pressure on payroll practices. That brings us to FinCEN, the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Unit. On June 5th, FinCEN issued an advisory urging banks and financial institutions to monitor for payroll, payment, and identity fraud schemes tied to unauthorized employment. The advisory focuses on risks involving employers, labor brokers, wage suppression, tax evasion, identity theft, and suspicious payment patterns. In plain English, banks are being drawn deeper into immigration-adjacent enforcement. That matters because financial institutions already carry heavy anti-money laundering responsibilities. If they are now expected to identify suspicious labor payment structures tied to unauthorized work, compliance teams will need to make judgment calls in an area that can be legally complex and politically explosive. The immigration fight is also moving into the sports economy. At SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, nearly 2,000 food and beverage workers have voted to authorize a strike ahead of the U.S. men's national team's World Cup opener. A strike authorization does not mean a strike is certain. But workers represented by Unite Here Local 11 are raising wage, job security, and immigration enforcement concerns, including fear of ICE activity around tournament operations. That's a reminder that major sporting events are not just games. They are labor systems, security systems, hospitality systems, and political stages. If one of those systems wobbles, the event can still happen, but the business risk changes. Now, let's move from domestic pressure to executive power and public symbolism. The Justice Department is defending President Trump's use of the White House ballroom in court, arguing that judges lack authority to interfere with the president's control of executive branch property, and that halting construction already underway would be impractical. Challengers argue that the project raises questions about improper use or politicization of public space. Separately, changes to Washington's symbolic landscape, including the repainting of the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool in a deep blue, have intensified debate over whether public monuments are being renovated, rebranded, or politically claimed. The legal question is one thing. The civic question is broader. Who gets to define national memory when one administration controls the imagery of public space? That issue may sound abstract, but symbols matter. They affect how citizens experience government, how administrations project power, and how future leaders inherit the physical stage of democracy. Overseas, the pressure points are no less serious. U.S.-Iran negotiations remain fragile, with reports that frozen Iranian assets are part of the discussion. One possible initial package has been described around $12 billion, while Iranian officials argue that more than $100 billion remains inaccessible because of sanctions, banking restrictions, litigation, and other barriers. Here, the key is precision. Not all frozen or inaccessible funds are the same. Some may be restricted by sanctions. Some may be trapped by banking channels. Some may be tied to court cases or legal claims. That means even if diplomats agree in principle, implementation could be messy. For markets, the asset issue matters because access to foreign reserves can affect Iran's currency, imports, fiscal flexibility, and regional posture. But any deal would also carry political risk in Washington, Israel, Gulf capitals, and Tehran. In Europe, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of choosing war over peace after Vladimir Putin rejected his call for an in-person meeting. Putin said he saw no reason to meet and thanked Trump for efforts to end the war, while saying there was still work to do. That is a diplomatic stalemate in a sentence. One side wants a meeting as a signal of seriousness. The other refuses, preserving leverage and denying legitimacy. The practical result is continued uncertainty around escalation, sanctions, defense spending, energy markets, and European security. Now, not all institutional stress is political. On the International Space Station, NASA briefly directed 5 crew members to shelter inside a docked SpaceX Crew Dragon, while Russian cosmonauts worked on leaks in the Zvezda service module transfer tunnel. NASA has said cracks in that area have caused small atmosphere leaks since 2019, and Russian space officials were assessing suspected leak areas after the rate increased. The crew returned to normal operations, but the incident matters because the ISS is aging infrastructure in orbit. It is also an international partnership under geopolitical strain. Every maintenance problem is technical, but it is also operational and diplomatic. Public health officials are facing another kind of clock. The CDC is warning that, without rapid and sustained intervention, the current Bundibugyo Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda could grow toward the scale of the 2014 to 2016 West Africa epidemic. As of June 2nd, the CDC reported 378 confirmed cases and 63 confirmed deaths. That does not mean that worst-case scenario will happen. It means the modeling is flashing red if public health response fails to reduce transmission. The challenge is that Bundibugyo virus does not have the same widely approved vaccine and treatment infrastructure as some other Ebola responses. So, the core tools are surveillance, isolation, infection control, contact tracing, community trust, and international support. And again, trust is the scarce resource. People have to believe health workers. Local communities have to cooperate. Governments have to move fast without appearing coercive or opaque. In Texas, agriculture officials are dealing with a different biological threat: New World screwworm. The USDA confirmed an infestation in a young calf in Zavala County, and officials have been using surveillance, movement controls, wound treatment, and sterile insect techniques to contain the parasite. This is not just a ranching story. The cattle industry is a major economic system. A parasite that infests living tissue in livestock, wildlife, pets, and sometimes humans can affect animal health, trade flows, veterinary costs, and consumer confidence. The goal now is containment before the problem becomes structural. Markets, meanwhile, delivered their own warning signal. U.S. stocks sold off sharply on Friday, led by a major retreat in technology and AI-linked names. The Nasdaq dropped just over 4%, the S&P 500 fell about 2.6%, and the Dow lost roughly 1.3%. The sell-off followed strong jobs data that pushed investors to reconsider how long the Federal Reserve may keep interest rates elevated. The interpretation is pretty clear. The market has been willing to pay up for AI growth, but that trade is sensitive to interest rates, capital spending, and valuation discipline. When yields rise, future profits are worth less in today's dollars. That matters especially for companies priced on aggressive long-term growth assumptions. And AI infrastructure is expensive. Chips, data centers, power, cloud capacity, talent, none of it is cheap. At the same time, Washington's AI debate is shifting. It is no longer only about safety rules or copyright or misinformation. It is now also about ownership, public stakes, and profit sharing. President Trump has said his team will look into government equity stakes in AI companies. Senator Bernie Sanders has proposed a 50% public ownership stake in major AI firms, with gains routed into a public wealth fund. Those ideas are very different politically, but they share a premise. If AI creates extraordinary private wealth, the public should capture some of the upside. For investors, that raises big questions. What is the legal authority? Would government ownership distort competition? Would it slow innovation or stabilize funding? Would taxpayers share gains or absorb losses? And how would political oversight affect companies whose products already touch speech, labor, national security, and education? Apple now steps into that environment, with WWDC beginning June 8. The company is expected to unveil iOS 27 and a major Siri overhaul as part of its AI reset. The stakes are high because Apple's earlier Apple Intelligence rollout was criticized for features that were advertised but delayed. For Apple, the test is not whether it can say AI on stage. The test is whether it can make AI useful inside the operating system, private enough for Apple's brand, and reliable enough that users actually change their behavior. If Apple delivers, it could reframe the consumer AI race. If it disappoints, investors may ask whether the company is still setting the agenda or reacting to it. SpaceX remains another major technology story, though one with more uncertainty. IPO speculation continues because SpaceX sits at the center of launch, satellites, defense relationships, and Starlink's recurring revenue model. But the timing and structure remain unknown. A full SpaceX listing, a Starlink spinoff, or staged offerings would each carry different implications for control, national security review, valuation, and dilution. So for investors, the practical takeaway is this. The space economy is bigger than SpaceX, but SpaceX remains the gravity well around which much of the sector's public market imagination revolves. No is sports, where the New York Knicks beat the San Antonio Spurs 105-104 in Game 2 of the NBA Finals, taking a 2-0 series lead. Karl Anthony Towns had 21 points and 13 rebounds. Victor Wembanyama scored 29 for San Antonio, but committed a late turnover and missed a potential game winner. For the Knicks, this is historic opportunity. They are 2 wins away from their first championship since 1973. For Wembanyama, this is the kind of painful late-game moment that becomes part of a superstar's education. Talent gets you to the finals. Decision-making, poise, and ball security win the final possessions. Game 3 at Madison Square Garden is now more than a basketball game. It is a pressure test for San Antonio, a potential coronation path for New York, and a ratings engine for the NBA. Even Elmo got pulled into the discourse after the Sesame Street account posted a neutral message hoping both teams would have fun. Knicks fans, naturally, accused the fictional New Yorker of fence-sitting. That part is funny, but it also says something real. Sports fandom turns brands, mascots, cities, and children's characters into symbols. In the attention economy, neutrality can look like betrayal. Finally, today marks the 82nd anniversary of D-Day. Veterans and officials gathered in Normandy to honor the Allied forces who landed on June 6, 1944. The anniversary carries added weight because the number of living World War II veterans is shrinking quickly. That gives memory itself an institutional role. Once first-hand witnesses are gone, societies rely on records, ceremonies, families, museums, schools, and public officials to carry the meaning forward. And that brings us back to the week's through line. Trust is not automatic. Election officials have to earn it through transparent counting. Courts have to earn it through credible limits on power. Public health agencies have to earn it before outbreaks explode. Markets have to earn it through price discovery and disclosure. Tech companies have to earn it by delivering products that work. Sports leagues and stadium operators have to earn it by balancing spectacle, labor, security, and fans. The next few days will tell us which of these stories are passing storms and which become structural tests. California's remaining ballots could reshape close races. The House could move quickly on immigration funding. SoFi labor talks could avert or trigger disruption. NASA and Roscosmos will keep monitoring the ISS leak. Public health teams will race Ebola's transmission curve. Apple will try to prove its AI strategy is real. And the Knicks will try to move within one win of a championship. The closing takeaway is simple. In a week crowded with ballots, borders, markets, and pressure points, the most important asset is not money, power, or even speed. It is legitimacy. Institutions can survive bad headlines, they can survive conflict. They can even survive mistakes if they acknowledge them and correct them. What they cannot easily survive is a broad public belief that the process is rigged, the facts are hidden, or the people in charge are improvising without accountability. That is why this week matters. Not because every story will become a crisis, but because every story is asking the same question. Can our systems move fast enough to respond, and carefully enough to be believed?